How do you fire 700 torpedoes and hit almost nothing? That's not a riddle. It's one of the darkest and most embarrassing secrets of America's Pacific War. Sleek, deadly, and hyped as the cavalry of the seas, PT boats were supposed to change the game fast, fearless predators haunting the night. Instead, they became floating death traps. Their torpedoes failed spectacularly. They bounced off enemy hulls, exploded prematurely, or just disappeared. While propaganda painted them as heroes, American sailors were dying on suicide missions with weapons everyone knew didn't work. The Japanese didn't fear them. They laughed. Even when John F. Kennedy's PT-109 was sliced in half by a destroyer, that boat had never fired a shot. This is the story the Navy tried to bury. The missions that failed, the enemy that celebrated, and the truth about one of the war's biggest screw-ups hidden behind medals and silence. They were sleek, loud, and fast enough to outrun most warships. To American audiences, PT boats were marketed like naval superheroes, small, scrappy, and built to punch above their weight. The Navy called them the cavalry of the seas. Magazine covers showed daring young officers on deck with the wind in their hair. Propaganda films showed gleaming boats slicing through the Pacific, guns blazing, torpedoes launching like thunderbolts across the sea. But while the idea of the PT boat was bold, the reality would soon become something much darker. PT stood for Patrol Torpedo. These weren't ironclad battleships. They were plywood gunboats, roughly 70 to 80 feet long, primarily built by two companies, Elco and Higgins Industries. Their bodies were made of layered mahogany wood. No armor, no steel plating. If a shell found you, it tore right through. If a torpedo exploded nearby, the blast could snap these boats in half. But what they lacked in protection, they were supposed to make up for in pure speed and aggression. Each PT boat carried a powerful set of weapons for its size. 4 Mark 13 torpedoes, twin, 50 caliber machine guns, and a rotating 20mm cannon on the rear deck. Some were even modified with depth charges, rocket launchers, and larger automatic weapons from salvaged aircraft. But their main weapon, the reason they existed at all, was the torpedo. The Navy envisioned them as the perfect vessel for hit-and-run sabotage. During World War I, destroyers had ruled the waves with speed and firepower. But by World War II, those destroyers had grown larger, slower, and more expensive. The U.S. needed something quick, agile, and disposable, something that could raid coastlines, interrupt supply chains, hunt big ships in the night, and vanish before anyone could counterattack. That became the PT boat's mission profile. Move at 40+ knots under darkness, ambush enemy convoys, launch torpedoes at close range, then speed away like a phantom. On paper, it sounded brilliant. In war, it rarely worked. But before the nightmare began, the optimism had been sky high. In early 1942, fresh off the trauma of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was in full-scale expansion mode in the Pacific. The Solomon Islands campaign, specifically around Guadalcanal, became one of the first critical testing grounds for the PT boats. The region was dense with islands, narrow straits, and hidden channels, the perfect environment for small, fast boats to operate. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, recently assigned to oversee PT operations out of Tulagi, had been one of those early believers. Young, smart, and loyal to the idea that America's industrial strength could turn the tide in the Pacific, Montgomery watched as squadrons of PT boats were shipped in, assembled, and deployed, each one manned by ambitious young sailors ready to prove themselves. The Navy's training manuals were filled with tactical diagrams and glowing projections. A single well-placed torpedo could cripple a Japanese cruiser, but Montgomery couldn't shake a nagging feeling. The tests had been too limited. The weapon systems had been designed for calm water, not combat zones. The torpedo's alleged performance had only been verified under ideal conditions. And most dangerously of all, leadership refused to question the data. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington had already signed off on the Mark 13 torpedo as the primary weapon on all aircraft and PT boats. It had a special magnetic detonator, a relatively new innovation that was supposed to explode the torpedo just underneath an enemy ship, cracking the hull open with water pressure. In theory, this would be even more damaging than a direct hit. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several, and none of them came to light until the PT boats met the enemy. The first live test came on August 20th, 1942. It was supposed to be textbook. 8 PT boats were sent to intercept a Japanese transport convoy off the coast of Vella Lavella. The night was clear and warm. The Japanese ships were large and visible. The PT boats sped toward their targets at full throttle engines, screaming like banshees, their crews focused and shaking with adrenaline. They fired their torpedoes. One by one, the weapons streaked out across the water, their wakes glowing with phosphorescent trails. This was it, the breakthrough the Navy had been waiting for. Except, nothing happened. One torpedo went directly under a Japanese transport and kept going. It never exploded. Another slammed into a destroyer with a dead-on hit and just bounced off. That sound haunts veteran accounts, a metallic clank like a hammer hitting a bell, echoing off the waves, followed by silence. No explosion, no damage. The Japanese ships, apparently stunned at first, opened fire. Heavy shells rained down around the PT boats, forcing them to scatter and retreat. 2 boats lost crewmen in the exchange. None of the Japanese vessels were even scratched. That night, the Americans had fired 17 Mark 13 torpedoes. 0 hits, 0 damage. Worse, the Japanese command got the after-action reports the next morning, and they laughed. Historical logs from the Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters show that commanders actually made jokes about the American PT boats and their flashy but meaningless attacks. "Just fireworks," one officer quipped. "A spectacle, sure, but no strike." For crews like Lieutenant Robert Reed of PT 109, the shock was unbearable. Reed's logs from that night drip with frustration. Hidden only slightly behind military formality, his crew had risked their lives. They had followed procedure, they closed to range, fired with precision, and still, the enemy sailed away untouched. His words reflected what others would soon discover. These weren't torpedoes. They were expensive fireworks, and people were dying to launch them. It took less than a month for the PT boat crews to stop believing in their mission. To outsiders, the PT boat community still looked like a force of elite swashbucklers, young naval cowboys, streaking across the social pages and making headlines. But below the surface, among the officers and enlisted men tasked with launching torpedoes that rarely worked, that image began to sour. They started joking that they were charging into battle with wooden swords, going toe-to-toe with steel giants who barely noticed their presence. When torpedoes exploded prematurely or not at all, frustration turned to fear, and then despair. One commander described it like this: "You're closing in on a monster, wide open, every nerve screaming to run. You fire, and the monster just watches. It isn't scared because it knows your weapons are toys." And yet, the missions kept coming. The Navy wouldn't admit a problem. Ordnance officials dismissed the failures as bad luck. Leaders told crews to try harder, get closer, fire under better conditions. What they didn't say was the truth, that the torpedoes they were depending on had never been fully tested, that the detonators didn't work reliably in the Pacific's magnetic field, and that the weapons they were betting lives on were catastrophically defective. And that was just the beginning. The Pacific was calm on the night of the 20th of August, 1942, but the men aboard the 8 American patrol torpedo boats slicing through the darkness were anything but. This was it. The first real combat test. For months, they trained in calm waters, drilled endlessly, listened to speeches about honor, speed, and surprise. Now they were face to face with reality. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese convoy was making its run, expected to include transports, destroyers, maybe even a cruiser. Valuable targets, dangerous ones. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, back at Tulagi, monitored the unfolding mission with cautious optimism. He had his doubts, yes, but this was the Navy's chance to silence the skeptics. Prove the PT boats could do what they were built for. Strike at night, blend into the shadows, cripple the enemy with a torpedo, and escape before anyone even knew they were there. Instead, what happened would become a textbook example of tactical failure multiplied by 17. The squadron's approach was near flawless. Engines throttled down to stalking speed, the PT boats crept into position. Lieutenant Robert Reed, commanding one of the Elko boats, watched as the formation aligned on the darkened silhouettes of Japanese vessels ahead, mostly destroyers and transports cruising through Vella Gulf, west of the Solomon Islands. Reed gave the order. 4 metal beasts slid from torpedo tubes with a percussive whoosh. Seconds later, more torpedoes joined them from the other boats. In total, 17 Mark 13 torpedoes were fired, a staggering salvo against unsuspecting ships. The night exploded with tension. Every man on board peered into the darkness, waiting for the orange blossom of an impact. A column of smoke, anything. Instead, silence. And then, the worst possible sound. Clang. One torpedo struck a Japanese destroyer head-on, metal on metal. The torpedo didn't detonate, just bounced off the hull like a soda can thrown at a tank. That distinct, hollow clang traveled across the water like a gunshot of failure. Another torpedo sliced under a transport's keel. It ran true, perfectly aligned, and just kept going right underneath, without exploding. The warhead, for all its thousands of dollars in promises, simply failed to trigger. Others vanished into the void. Not one hit, not one detonation, not a single functioning result from a precision attack under ideal conditions, close range, steady approach, clear targets. By the time the Japanese guns opened up, the Americans already knew the answer. They hadn't hurt the enemy. They had just alerted them. Searchlights snapped on sharp white beams, transforming the Black Sea into a deadly spotlight. Shells from 5-inch naval guns began shrieking across the surface. Water erupted around the retreating PT boats as gunners desperately tried to deflect pursuit. Several boats took minor damage. Reed's boat limped away under heavy fire, trailed by columns of spray kicked up by shrapnel. Behind them, the convoy kept moving, entirely unharmed, probably confused why the Americans had essentially launched a fireworks show and fled. Because that's how the Japanese saw it. A joke, a spectacle, not a threat. Commander Teo Kurita, the officer overseeing Imperial Japanese destroyers assigned to that area, received the post-battle analysis with mild curiosity at first. Then he smiled. Laughed, actually. Archived testimony and captured war records indicate that Kurita read through the post-action report, noting the 17 torpedoes fired and 0 effects, and passed it on with a handwritten note. We must be careful. The next ones may bring music, not just light. It became a running joke within his fleet. The American torpedo display. But to the American crews, nothing was funny. Lieutenant Reed's post-action report was loaded with barely contained rage. On paper, it sounded like a carefully worded debrief. In between the lines, you can hear the disbelief, the hopelessness. Reed had followed doctrine. The boats had performed well. The torpedoes had armed properly, run true. But nothing had worked. His crew, young, brave, and already battle-hardened, began to adopt a grim slogan. Wooden swords against steel giants. Torpedo attacks became less about offensive victory and more about desperate gestures. A gamble. The crew fired 4 torpedoes and held their breath, praying just one would work. If it didn't, the only option left was to turn tail and hope they weren't caught in the retaliatory spray. And if you were caught, well, you weren't surviving long. Back in Brisbane, Captain James Fife, who oversaw submarine operations, had already been sounding the alarm about torpedo failures since the earliest days of the war, but no one had really listened. His submarines were experiencing similar problems. Torpedoes running too deep, failing to explode on contact, or detonating prematurely miles from any target. Now, it wasn't just submarines. It was the PT boats too. The disaster at Vella La Vella made it undeniable. The Mark 13 torpedo, the weapon every PT boat depended on, was broken. Badly. The Navy's response? Silence. At worst, the official channels blamed operator error. At best, commanders encouraged more rigorous training and closer approaches. In other words, get even closer to the destroyers next time. Maybe that'll help. It didn't, because the problem wasn't the boats. It was the torpedoes themselves. And yet, the missions kept coming. Leadership in Washington still believed in the propaganda machine they'd created. PT boats, once glamorized as elite fighting vessels, were now being used like bait sent out in dangerous night missions against better-armed opponents. All because someone refused to admit the weapon was broken. The psychological toll was staggering. Crews began naming their torpedoes out of superstition. Some held baptism ceremonies before combat, sarcastically christening the weapons like ships, hoping to wake them up. Others just stopped caring. When you fire 4 torpedoes at a target, you can see, and nothing happens. It doesn't just change your tactics. It changes your faith. And that began to show. Mission after mission returned with the same reports. No results. Failed to detonate. Torpedoes passed under target. Direct hit no effect. In the early days, commanders thought this kind of failure meant bad aim, poor training. But eventually, they realized something far worse. No matter how brave, fast, or skilled these PT boat crews were, they had been sent into combat with weapons that literally could not do the very thing they were designed to do. The Vela La Vela mission should have been a huge win. All the conditions were right. The target was real. The boats performed perfectly. And still, the engagement produced nothing but humiliation. That one battle set the tone for the next entire chapter of the Pacific War. The Japanese stopped fearing PT boats. American sailors stopped trusting their own gear. Officers in the field started filing classified complaints with growing urgency. And yet there would be hundreds more missions just like this. Because no one, not Washington, not the Bureau of Ordnance, not Navy brass wanted to admit the truth. So PT boat after PT boat kept going into the night, firing more torpedoes, and praying this time, maybe one of them would work. After Vela La Vela, the commanding officers hoped it had been a fluke, a one-off disaster, a stroke of bad luck in an otherwise promising weapon program. But it wasn't a fluke, it was a preview. In the weeks that followed, the PT boat squadrons ran dozens of missions across the Solomon Islands, interdicting Japanese convoys, ambushing supply runs, and pressing attacks under moonlit skies. And again, torpedoes failed. They didn't detonate. They ran too deep. They veered off course. They exploded before reaching the target. Or after it passed. One officer called it the world's most expensive guessing game. The only certainty was that somebody was going to die, but it probably wouldn't be the enemy. The official numbers started to trickle in. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, who had believed in the PT program from the start, now faced wave after wave of failure reports. He watched the statistics with growing disbelief. In one engagement, 7 torpedoes fired, 0 hits. Next mission, 4 fired. 1 ran circular and nearly hit the firing boat. Another attack, 8 torpedoes launched. 5 exploded before reaching their targets. 1 struck a Japanese hull, and again, it didn't go off. Montgomery's growing horror wasn't just about poor results. It was that every single report from the field matched. Different boat, different commander. Same story, torpedoes don't work. We shouldn't be using them. No one is listening. And yet the Navy's top brass continued to cite PT boats as a combat success. Official briefings leaned hard on Kennedy's heroic survival after the destruction of PT-109, ignoring the fact that his boat never fired a torpedo and was cut in half like paperboard under a destroyer's bow. What mattered in Washington wasn't whether the weapons worked. It was how the public felt. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific, morale among PT boat crews was unraveling. Ensign John Searles, assigned to PT-59, began writing home more often. His letters started out optimistic, even energetic, as if he still believed the official story. But over time, the tone shifted. His words grew darker, more confused, more self-doubting. In one letter, he confessed to his family, "I feel sick before every launch. Not because I'm scared of dying, but because I know our weapons won't do anything. We'll fire and nothing will happen. And then we'll be trapped again, with nothing but speed and luck between us and a 5-inch shell." His boat had fired 16 torpedoes in combat. 16 failures. Each failure meant more danger. Each miss meant a longer approach next time, a higher risk, a closer shot, and never any payoff. Searles ended one letter with a question that would haunt commanders for the rest of the war. Do you think it makes us cowards if we're relieved when our torpedoes miss? Because when they fail, at least we don't have to die tonight. This quiet breakdown was spreading. Across the PT squadrons, officers began secretly altering tactics. Some intentionally held back 1 or 2 torpedoes not because they needed them saved, but because they simply couldn't bring themselves to waste them. Crew members started begging mechanics to tune the warheads. Others painted joke slogans on their torpedoes. One crew named theirs, "Good luck, you'll need it." Another stenciled, "Probably won't work." On the docks at Tulagi, mechanics would test-fire torpedo arming systems and watch with dismay as the gyroscope spun sluggishly, or the magnetic detonators armed at the wrong time, or not at all. What made it worse? The Mark 13 torpedo came with two fail points. First, the magnetic detonator, the device designed to explode the torpedo underneath a ship's hull. On paper, this was ideal, kill the ship by attacking its structural weakness. But in reality, Earth's magnetic field was different in the Pacific than in the Atlantic. The Mark 6 exploder, a device built during peacetime and barely combat tested, constantly misfired in these conditions. If the Mark 6 failed, the torpedo defaulted to its backup contact fuse, the mechanical detonator meant to trigger on impact. But that was often even worse. The contact fuse was so fragile, it would sometimes shatter rather than activate, especially if the torpedo hit at an angle or at high speed. Multiple confirmed cases exist in field reports where a torpedo hit a Japanese hull squarely and broke on contact. By September 1942, Captain James Fife, still hammering Washington from his sub-base in Brisbane, issued his sharpest warning yet. At this point, it would be safer for the crew to throw the torpedo by hand. Commanders in the field began begging for alternatives. Montgomery eventually authorized units at Tulagi to begin field modifications, disabling the magnetic detonator and switching to impact-only fusing. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Engineers could fix a weapon design broken. The depth settings were still malfunctioning. Warheads were still too light. Stabilizers triggered porpoising where the torpedo broke surface repeatedly before diving like a drunk submarine. Even after local fixes, the weapon was still producing hit rates below 5%. To put that into context, naval gunnery with unguided rounds and no radar was often hitting at 25% or more. The Japanese began to notice not just the attacks, but the pattern. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet, began recording his observations in wartime journals. At first, the entries expressed curiosity, then amusement, eventually disbelief. "They fire and fire, but nothing ever happens," he noted in one entry. "We began referring to them unofficially as marching lights, since we could count on the torpedoes to pass us by like a parade." His officers started filing standardized after-action responses to PT boat attacks. No hits, no damage, illuminated presence only. What that meant, translated, was simple. Lots of flashy wakes, lots of glowing trails, no actual consequences. The American Navy, meanwhile, was doubling down on broken doctrine. New PT squadrons arrived in theater, their crews trained under the same assumptions. Commanders gave speeches to rally morale, insisting the boats were turning the tide on the Tokyo Express. But anyone reading the logs knew different. By early November, destroyer commanders had started advising their PT boat crews not to engage in torpedo runs unless contact was firm and unavoidable. In private, some even called the torpedo systems mission traps, weaponry that encouraged aggression without offering a way to actually win. And with every failed torpedo run came more casualties. PT 112 was lost after a nighttime blitz that ended with it being shredded by return fire. No torpedoes hit. PT 44 ran aground while retreating after a failed salvo. Japanese troops captured the crew. The men were executed within 48 hours. PT 37 was blown apart when it got too close to a destroyer that never even bothered to maneuver, just turned its guns and sliced the boat in half in broad daylight. The official tally kept rising. The hit count didn't. At this point, Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the entire U.S. fleet, could no longer ignore the statistics. By October 1942, over 200 torpedoes had been fired across dozens of missions. Confirmed hits, still in the single digits. King authorized a formal investigation, but it wouldn't be finished for months. Meanwhile, men continued going out with torpedoes they knew would fail. Some commanders tried to spin it. They emphasized courage in the face of danger. A few even suggested that the act of engagement itself, the attempt, had its own value. That became the unofficial pep talk. You're not here to hit, you're here to harass. But the crews weren't buying that anymore. They'd seen their weapons fail. They'd seen their friends tortured by the enemy. They'd lost boats, nights, months, and men for nothing. And they knew this was no longer a string of bad luck. It was a pattern, and it was going to get worse. By the fall of 1942, the front lines were littered with torpedoes that never exploded. PT boat captains had sent up blistering reports. Submarine commanders were filing formal complaints. Entire missions were failing. and some commands had already lost faith in the one weapon that was supposed to define the campaign. So what exactly was wrong with the Mark 13 torpedo? To answer that, you have to go all the way back before Pearl Harbor, before the Solomon Islands, to where the weapon was actually born, the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. There, during the quiet peacetime years of the 1932nd, engineers under the Bureau of Ordnance developed America's next-generation aircraft and small boat torpedo. It was compact, streamlined, and versatile. It featured an aluminum alloy warhead, a high-speed propulsion system, and most importantly, a cutting-edge magnetic detonator known as the Mark 6 exploder. On paper, it looked brilliant. In the lab, it even worked sometimes. But out in the real ocean, under real combat conditions, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The Mark 13 torpedo was cursed by 3 critical design flaws. Any one of them could cripple a weapon. All 3 together, deadly, but not to the enemy. 1. The magnetic exploder didn't work. The Mark 6 was an experimental feature. Rather than detonating on impact, it was designed to sense the magnetic field of a ship's hull as it passed underneath, then trigger the explosion at the perfect moment to break the ship's spine using pressure. In theory, this was more lethal than a simple hull impact. In reality, it was a roll of the dice. The Earth's magnetic field isn't constant, and in the Pacific, it differed dramatically from the areas the torpedo was tested in. Minute variations in magnetism never accounted for in lab tests rendered the device completely unreliable. Many torpedoes exploded early, late, or not at all simply due to environmental interference. 2. The contact exploder was fragile. As a backup, the torpedo could also use a mechanical impact fuse. Basically, if it hit the side of a ship, the warhead should still go off. But the contact fuse was made from brittle metals and wasn't designed to handle the high-speed impact of an angled hit. Often, it snapped or shattered, leaving the detonator entirely inactive even after a direct strike. 3. They ran too deep. Each Mark 13 had a depth-setting device, a mechanical mechanism meant to keep the torpedo on its programmed course, usually just a few feet below the surface. That device was faulty too. In combat, under battlefield pressure and launch stress, the torpedoes often sank too low, missing ships completely and passing underneath harmlessly. The result? A torpedo perfectly designed to look good on paper and fail where it mattered most. And perhaps worst of all, the Navy knew. Reports about the Mark 13's performance issues had been circulating since the war began. Submarine commanders like Captain James Fife had been warning about problems as far back as January 1942. His skippers reported torpedoes skimming below targets, bouncing off destroyers, or detonating half a mile early. When Fife forwarded these problems to Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance responded with dismissive memos, claiming the issues were due to operator error rather than faulty design. PT boat crews sent similar field reports, some even smuggling photographs and fragments of malfunctioned torpedoes to make their case. But back at headquarters, the Navy's administrative elite doubled down on silence. If they admitted the torpedoes were defective, it would mean halting production, rewriting tactical manuals, modifying thousands of launchers, and worst of all, admitting fault in a weapon system already deployed in combat. That meant scandal, accountability, and possibly the careers of senior officials in the Bureau of Ordnance. So instead, they deflected. Crews on the front lines were told they were firing inaccurately, that torpedoes weren't hitting because they weren't approaching correctly, that with the right training, the weapons would perform. But battle after battle told a different story. The torpedo that sank no enemy ships became an open secret. Mechanics at Tulagi began disabling the magnetic exploders in secret. They turned off the Mark 6 manually, opting for the harder-to-fail contact fuse. But that didn't fix everything. The issues with depth control and detonation still played havoc with combat performance. Even after field modifications, crews were still reporting hit rates below 5%. A detailed analysis compiled in October 1942 revealed that, by then, over 300 torpedoes had been fired from PT boats and submarines in the South Pacific. Fewer than 10 had caused significant damage. Only 3 had sunk confirmed enemy ships. To understand how bad that is, modern naval artillery using unguided fire control systems achieved 6 times better hit rates against moving targets. That meant PT boats, which were only armed with 4 torpedoes each, had to get insanely close to enemy ships just for a tiny chance of striking gold. In naval terms, that's like charging into machine gun fire with a broken pistol. And yet, despite all of this, there were no recalls, no mass upgrades, no supply chain pivot. Instead, naval leadership reacted with the most dangerous policy in wartime. They trusted their bureaucracy more than their soldiers. They bet on institutional pride over proof. They told frontline commanders like Lieutenant Commander Montgomery that changes were being evaluated. Meanwhile, men kept dying. One PT boat commander named Howard Shorty Bowers learned the truth the hard way. On the 11th of September 1942, his boat, PT 137, tailed a Japanese cruiser for hours, stalking it through rough seas, waiting for the perfect angle. He fired 4 torpedoes at a range of 800 yards, practically point blank. Torpedo Heshone exploded early, just 200 yards off the bow. The blast rocked the PT boat and almost capsized it. Torpedo Hesh-2's engine died mid-run, and it sank straight down. Torpedo Hesh-3 breached the surface several times, then dove and passed harmlessly under the cruiser. Torpedo Hesh-4 finally hit dead center, a textbook strike. But again, clang, no detonation. The cruiser turned. Searchlights flared to life. Gunfire followed accurately, devastating. Bowers' boat barely escaped, battered and low on fuel. 2 of his men were bleeding. The cruiser they stalked had not slowed down for a moment. These weren't isolated issues. By late October 1942, the cracks broke wide open. Under increasing pressure from submarine commanders, PT officers, and statisticians at fleet headquarters, Admiral Ernest King finally authorized a formal investigation into the Mark 13 and its related components. The investigation team's private conclusions were chilling. The Mark 13 had passed no significant combat testing before mass deployment. The magnetic exploder was proven to fail in the majority of scenarios. The depth setters were off by a margin of 4 to 10 feet, enough to miss destroyers completely. The Bureau of Ordnance had ignored field reports for over 9 months. In other words, the Navy had sent frontline combat crews into war using a weapon system they knew wasn't working. And when it failed, instead of fixing it, they blamed the men using it. Within weeks, the Navy began issuing quiet orders to deactivate the magnetic detonators fleet-wide, officially acknowledging that the Mark 6 was a dud. But the damage had already been done. Hundreds of torpedoes had been wasted. Dozens of PT boats had been sunk. All because no one was willing to admit the gear was broken. For sailors on the water, the shame wasn't in losing. It was in being told that the loss wasn't happening in being gaslit by their own command. They never doubted their courage, but they had every reason to doubt their equipment. And for hundreds of sailors who would never return home, that betrayal was fatal. On the night of August 2nd, 1943, a sleepy stretch of the Solomon Islands called Blackett Strait became the site of one of World War II's most famous naval incidents. It involved a young lieutenant, a destroyer moving at 30 knots, and a patrol torpedo boat that didn't fire a single shot. That lieutenant's name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. His boat, PT 109. The story that followed became the foundation of a war legend, one that would eventually help propel Kennedy to the White House. But behind the headlines and hero worship, the truth told a different tale. One of poor positioning, faulty weapons, and a Navy desperate for a narrative that the weapons couldn't give them, so they found it in a man instead. Kennedy's PT boat was part of a squadron tasked with intercepting a high-speed Japanese convoy. One of the infamous Tokyo Express runs delivering troops to the front lines at Guadalcanal. By now, the Navy knew torpedo attacks from PT boats were unreliable, but they had no better options in the cramped shallows of the Solomon Islands. And so, again, the plywood hunters were told to go forward and hope. Kennedy knew the odds. His crew knew it too. By this point, sailors were openly trading whispers about torpedoes that detonated early or not at all. Morale was low, but fatalism had taken hold. That night, PT 109 was patrolling with its engines running at low throttle, a standard tactic meant to reduce wake visibility and engine noise, crucial for getting in close. It was also the same tactic that would lead them directly into disaster. The destroyer Amagiri, under Japanese commander Kohei Hanami, was barreling south at full speed 30 knots delivering supplies through Blackett Strait. It wasn't even trying to hide, just fast, efficient, and brutal. At roughly 2:30 a.m., the Amagiri's watchman suddenly spotted something in the water. Kennedy's boat, sitting nearly idle. A torpedo boat sitting, idling in waters it was supposed to be dominating, seen before it could engage. Too slow to react. Hanami's crew didn't hesitate. They didn't fire, didn't turn. They just kept going. Kennedy only spotted the destroyer seconds before impact. His crew scrambled. He gunned the engines, but it was too late. The 2,000-ton Amagiri sliced straight through PT-109's wooden hull, nearly cutting it in half. Two of Kennedy's men, Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold Marney, were killed instantly, one presumably struck in the collision's initial impact. The other likely chewed into the Amagiri's turning propellers. The fuel tanks exploded, erupting into a fireball that lit up the strait for miles. Burning gasoline spread across the water. The rest of the crew, including Kennedy, was flung into the sea, clinging to debris, choking on smoke and salt water. And then, the Amagiri just kept going, as if it hadn't even noticed what it had just done. In the days that followed, newspapers hailed the event as a nearly mythic tale of survival. Kennedy, despite his chronic back pain, reportedly towed badly burned crewman Patrick McMahon by his life jacket held in Kennedy's teeth while swimming 3 miles to the tiny islet later named Plum Pudding Island. For 5 days, the crew survived on coconuts and rainwater. Kennedy would swim out again, this time trying to signal passing PT boats with a flashlight, nearly drawing enemy fire. When help finally arrived, it wasn't luck. It was Kennedy's relentless will to survive that made the difference. He was hailed as a hero back home. His bravery was real, his actions laudable. In speeches, interviews, and his presidential campaign, the story of PT-109 became a cornerstone of his image. But what most Americans didn't hear was the part the Navy intentionally left out. The uncomfortable truth was this: PT-109 never fired a single weapon. No torpedoes, no machine guns, no defensive action whatsoever. The boat was destroyed, not in a firestorm of battle, but because it was caught off guard, idling in enemy territory, and completely unable to respond fast enough to prevent its own annihilation. There were no torpedo malfunctions that night because they never had the chance to fire. And yet, the deeper issue still applies. Even if they had launched a salvo, would it have mattered? By August 1943, the PT crews had already seen hundreds of torpedoes fizzle out short of their mark. Destroyers, like the one that destroyed PT-109, were practically immune. And this wasn't just opinion. Japanese records after the war confirmed it, repeatedly noting that American torpedoes rarely posed serious threat unless launched by submarines, and even then, inconsistently. Commander Hanami's post-battle report described the incident in the most mundane terms imaginable. Collision with enemy patrol craft. Object seen late. Contact made. No evasive maneuver required. Minor, superficial damage to bow. That was it. To the Japanese, the destruction of PT-109 wasn't a battle. It was a bump in the night. The Amagiri didn't even stop to fire or confirm the kill. It just disappeared into the black water, while Kennedy and his remaining crew waited in silence for daylight, wrapped in flames and smoke. It would become a defining moment, forged out of a perfectly avoidable failure. That may be the darkest irony of the entire PT boat campaign. Many of the finest acts of bravery came not during victory, but from surviving weapon failures and mission breakdowns. Kennedy's valor could never be questioned. He saved his men. He refused rescue until the last body was accounted for. He returned to command another boat, PT-59, this time reconfigured as a gunboat without torpedoes. The Navy quietly learned its lesson from that point forward. Stop relying on what doesn't work. But publicly, they said nothing. The loss of PT-109 was spun into glory, a minor setback in a heroic war story. The tactical blunders were invisible, the silence strategic. Because while America desperately needed heroes, the truth could wait. And in the background, another truth continued ticking. By August 1943, PT boats had now fired over 700 torpedoes in combat, and had sunk almost nothing. The PT-109 story teaches us something far more complicated than simple courage or accident. It shows how a war machine can fail entirely, how weapons praised in the newspapers can be useless in battle, how a government can cover its embarrassment by highlighting the sacrifice of its soldiers, The truth of PT-109 isn't just that it sank, or that its commander became president. It's that the boat part of the Navy's elite Mosquito fleet was destroyed by the very enemy it was meant to hunt without ever getting a shot off. And the system behind it called that a success. By late 1943, the evidence was impossible to ignore. American PT boats had launched over 700 torpedoes across the Solomon Islands. Most of those had missed, malfunctioned, or done absolutely nothing. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't bad luck. It was physics, engineering failure, institutional complacency, and it was costing lives. But the real scandal wasn't just that the torpedoes didn't work. It was that the Navy knew and for over a year did nothing. From the air-conditioned offices in Washington, official reports still painted a picture of controlled chaos. Torpedo boats were harassing Japanese convoys, engaging in disruptive night actions, and holding the line. But on the docks at Tulagi and Rendova, crews were holding something else. Pieces of exploded torpedoes that never hit anything. PT boat officers began compiling their own stats because they no longer trusted headquarters, and what they found was horrifying. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, now fully disillusioned, assigned his staff to do the math. They combined engagement logs from dozens of operations, filtered out false positives, and confirmed 743 torpedoes fired from PT boats. Only 18 hits that caused any significant damage. 6 actual confirmed sinkings. That's one ship for every 124 torpedoes launched. Even wartime submarines using similar faulty torpedoes were scoring kill ratios of 1:5 to 1, sometimes better. PT boats weren't just ineffective, they were operating at worse than lottery odds. Montgomery put it bluntly in his briefing to senior officers. This is not a combat doctrine. This is a suicide pact, wrapped in good intentions. And he wasn't alone. One of the most revealing moments came during a tense meeting in September 1943 at Noumea, where Admiral William Bull Halsey had ordered a rare in-person war council. In attendance, PT squadron leaders, engineering officers, intelligence staff, and a selection of increasingly angry field commanders. The atmosphere was electric. Officers had been waiting for months to say what couldn't be allowed in official memos. And when they were finally given the floor, they held nothing back. Lieutenant Commander Robert Reed, who had been present at Vella La Vella, spoke first. He'd survived half a dozen deadly missions, narrowly escaped death more than once, and commanded PT 159, a boat that had seen 3 torpedoes misfire so badly that one of them circled back. In front of the assembled high command, he delivered a blistering quote, "At 800 yards, enemy destroyers can rip us in half with a single salvo. To have even a slim chance of damaging them, we have to close within that kill zone with 4 torpedoes that don't work. You're not asking us to fight. You're sending us to die, pure and simple." Not a single voice interrupted him, not even the admirals. Because what could they say? They already knew he was right. Rear Admiral Montgomery, now one of the highest-ranking officers advocating for reform, laid out the situation in numbers. More than 40% of PT boats deployed to the South Pacific had suffered severe casualties. Many had been destroyed after firing torpedoes that failed to hit or failed to explode. In multiple reports, Japanese destroyers had described PT attacks as nuisance actions, not threats. Captured Japanese naval diaries mocked the PT force. Enemy commanders referred to them as fireworks boats or the noisy ghosts. One Japanese admiral wrote, "We fear their bravery, not their weapons." That line stuck with Montgomery. And it haunted him. Because bravery wasn't enough. His men deserved weapons that worked. But even with those damning numbers, even with all this truth laid bare, the Navy's original stance refused to fully collapse. Instead of admitting total failure, top brass started rewriting the mission. The new talking points? PT boats were multi-role assets. Their value wasn't just in torpedo strikes, it was in harassment, coastal scouting, and supporting ground operations. In private, commanders began pushing this realignment. In public, the tales of torpedo glory quietly disappeared. Even in the media, coverage of PT boats shifted. No more high-drama stories about daring night strikes. No more photo ops of crews standing next to torpedo tubes. Instead, interviews featured flexibility, resilience, and redeployment success in gun-based roles. The metaphor changed. The cavalry of the seas had become something else entirely. And in the face of this quiet repositioning, the crews themselves were watching their mission disappear in real time. Gone were the rousing speeches about taking down destroyers and cruisers. In their place, safety lectures, night maneuvers with machine guns, not torpedoes, modified boats, stripped tubes, new loadouts. PT boats were being transformed. Some crews welcomed it grateful, finally, to have weapons that actually hit when you pulled the trigger. Others weren't so quick to forgive. Ensign Robert Ballantyne, who had been with the PT force since the early months, summed up the shift in a letter. "We didn't lose our courage. We lost faith. Not in America, but in the people who sent us into battle with weapons they knew would fail. We trusted them. They let us down. We survived anyway." And that's the terrifying truth behind all the numbers and silence. The men didn't fail. The weapons did. And those men were kept in harm's way long after Washington knew better. Eventually, the Bureau of Ordnance caved, sort of. Modifications were allowed. Magnetic triggers scrapped. Contact fuses hardened. Depth settings recalibrated. But the damage was already done. So much of the PT boat saga had been built around a myth. The myth that tiny boats, powered by courage and speed, could strike down destroyers with a single punch. But the truth was never about speed. It wasn't about bravery. It was about bureaucracy. A paper war waged inside a real one, a war between truth and denial, between combat results and PR campaigns. And the cost of that paper war was steep. Over 800 torpedoes fired across the Pacific, fewer than 30 confirmed successful hits, dozens of boats lost, hundreds of sailors killed, not by the enemy, but by their own equipment. The Navy would recover, the crews would adapt, new gun-focused missions would turn the tide in future operations. But this moment, this breaking point in 1943, marked a reckoning, a realization shared by everyone from commanders to crew. You can't win wars with weapons your enemy doesn't respect, and you can't keep sending men to die just because you're too proud to admit you were wrong. By the end of 1943, the dream of the torpedo boat was officially dead. But the sailor's spirit? That wasn't going anywhere. The PT boat crews who had spent the previous 18 months launching broken weapons into the darkness, knowing full well they'd probably miss, had seen enough failure to bury an entire doctrine. And yet, they hadn't broken. They adapted. Because if the Navy wouldn't abandon the ships, then the men aboard them would figure out how to make those floating coffins into something actually useful. It began quietly small modifications at first. Crewmen swapping out torpedo tubes for extra machine guns. Mechanics welding scavenged 40mm cannons on the decks. Salvaged aircraft weapons mounted on homemade brackets. Whatever they could find, they used. By early 1944, what had once been a sleek torpedo boat now looked more like a floating artillery platform. And the transformation wasn't just physical, it was strategic. The PT boat's original mission, intercepting major warships in open water, had failed for one simple reason. It had been built around a weapon that didn't work. But there was another, more realistic target for these boats. Japanese supply barges. They weren't fast. They weren't armored. They didn't come escorted by cruisers. But they were absolutely essential to the Japanese war machine. And unlike destroyers, they could be stopped. These barges, slow-moving, often packed with troops and ammunition, navigated close to shorelines under cover of night, feeding the scattered garrisons across the Pacific. The Americans had a word for this new phase: barge hunting, and it was deadly. On the 8th of January 1944, the Navy officially gave its blessing to a new generation of modified PT boats. Gone were the sleek lines and torpedo-centric layouts. In their place, twin 40mm Bofors guns, 20mm and 50 calories machine guns scattered across the deck. Sometimes even rocket launchers strapped to makeshift racks. And yes, torpedo tubes remained, but now as backups, afterthoughts, a shadow of what they once meant. PT boats had stopped pretending to be David against Goliath and finally embraced what they were always meant to be: fast, flexible killers of opportunity. Lieutenant John Duke Coley was one of the first to embrace the transition. On February 3, 1944, his heavily modified PT-191 led a sortie off the coast of New Britain, where American intelligence had spotted a convoy of Japanese barges preparing a nighttime resupply run. Coley's division of 4 PT boats roared in under starlight. But this time, they didn't line up for torpedo shots. There was no waiting, no 800-yard nervous countdown. As soon as the barges entered, visual range guns opened up instantly. Tracers streaked over the waves. Explosive rounds tore into wooden hulls. Munitions piled on the barges caught fire and began to cook off, sending fireballs into the air. Within 15 minutes, 7 enemy barges were either burning, sinking, or abandoned. Not a single American was wounded. Not one torpedo had been fired. It was the kind of clean, efficient destruction that PT crews had been promised 2 years earlier but never experienced during the torpedo era. Coley's after-action report said it best. "For the first time, I saw what a PT boat was capable of." And he wasn't alone. As more boats were converted, crews began reporting higher success rates, fewer casualties, and better morale. Unlike torpedoes, which had been an eternal gamble, machine guns and artillery were instant cause and effect. You pulled the trigger, something exploded. Ammunition depots, shore positions, transport boats, finally, there were results. Veterans who had once begged not to be sent on another failed torpedo run were now volunteering to mount extra patrols. There was a sense of redemption, a feeling that the torment of 1942 and 1943 hadn't been in vain, but had forged something stronger, and the Japanese noticed. Commanders like Captain Tamichihara, whose destroyer Shiguri had shrugged off countless PT boat attacks with ease, suddenly found themselves dodging carefully timed ambushes at river mouths and tight straits where there was no room to maneuver. Hara later admitted in his memoirs, "The torpedoes were a joke, but once the Americans became gunboats, they became real threats. Supply lines that had once run almost untouched, now slowed, rerouted, or were abandoned entirely." By mid-1944, PT boats were sinking more Japanese vessels per month than in all of 1943 combined, and they were doing it with fewer losses, less fuel, and much greater accuracy. No more stealth attacks, hoping for ghost-like kills. Now it was surprise, followed by sheer, overwhelming firepower. Machine guns, rockets, twin 40-seconds chattering across the ocean. This wasn't finesse. It was violence. Focused, direct, and finally effective. The change was so complete that by D-Day, in Europe, many Pacific-based PT boats had their torpedo tubes removed entirely. They weren't ashamed of it. They celebrated it. Because everyone in those squadrons knew the truth. You don't mourn a broken weapon. You throw it away and build something that actually wins the fight. PT boat doctrine manuals were rewritten. Training programs eliminated torpedo strategy from core curriculum. Supply lines shifted to accommodate more ammo, rockets, and extra gunners rather than spare torpedo parts nobody trusted. And they kept adapting. Some later PT boats would be fitted out to support amphibious landings, functioning as quick-reaction artillery support. Others became interceptors for Japanese suicide boats. One division even helped coordinate fire missions on shore emplacements. These weren't torpedo boats anymore. They were gun platforms. Fast, hard-hitting, dangerous. The Navy had started the war with a lie dressed in wood and brass. But by the time victory came into focus, the PT boat force had become something real, something deadly, something earned. The transformation cost time. It cost men, but it changed everything. For the Japanese, what once had been a laughing matter, the fireworks fleet, was now a genuine operational challenge. For the Americans, it was vindication. For the crews, it was personal. Machine guns didn't gem like torpedo detonators. Cannons didn't pass harmlessly under hulls. When they fired, things exploded. And everyone finally understood a brutal truth. It wasn't the boats that had been the problem. It was the belief that a broken tool could still do the job. Not anymore. By the time the war ended, the PT boats were barely recognizable from what they were in 1942. Sleek torpedo hunters had become gun-laden predators, patrolling shallows, intercepting barges, and supporting landings in places most warships couldn't even reach. They had proven their worth, but not in the way they were envisioned. Because for all the myths and medals, all the headlines about speed, spirit, and American bravery, the real story of the PT boats wasn't one of triumph by design. It was triumph through pure adaptation, through anger, through loss, and through finally acknowledging what had gone so horribly wrong. Let's say it plainly. The original PT boat mission was a failure. Not because the crews weren't brave, not because they didn't try hard enough, not because the enemy was too strong. It failed because the Navy sent them to war with a weapon that did not work. The Mark 13 torpedo became one of the most infamous weapon systems of the entire Pacific theater. By the Navy's own numbers, compiled in post-war audits, over 1,200 torpedoes were launched by PT boats during the conflict. Fewer than 30 ever hit and caused significant damage. And far fewer than that actually sank enemy ships. The kill ratio across the entire campaign? Roughly 124 torpedoes fired for every one ship sunk. To visualize that, imagine 30 pints boats launching everything they had only for one Japanese ship to go down. You don't just get numbers like that from bad aim. It takes institutional failure to produce a disaster that big. And in the case of the PT program, failure had a face. The Bureau of Ordnance. The engineers, policymakers, and procurement officers responsible for the Mark 13 torpedo had dismissed years of concerns, hushed internal reports, and insisted until the evidence could no longer be ignored that the problem was the men, not the weapon. But those men were bleeding in the water. They were watching torpedoes vanish beneath Japanese destroyers. Some died after failing to get a single functioning shot off. The field reports weren't small complaints. They were cries for help, and they were ignored. After the war, heads did roll. Investigations ripped through the hierarchy. Procurement protocols were rewritten. Testing processes, once rubber-stamped in peacetime labs, were overhauled with a new requirement: real-world combat simulation, under actual use conditions, before mass deployment. The Mark 13 itself was redesigned, improved by war's end, but by then, the PT boats that had once relied on it had already moved on. Weapon systems that had gotten men killed were now burned into training manuals, not as tactics, but as cautionary tales. One of those voices, perhaps the loudest, came from Captain Alan Montgomery, the same officer who had once believed in the PT boat program more than anyone. After the war, he was called to testify before Congress. When asked what caused the torpedo failures, he didn't point fingers at sailors or weather or Japanese defenses. He pointed directly at the system. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was a culture of arrogance, denial, and delay, he told them. When men are risking their lives, a broken weapon is not just a failure, it's a betrayal. His testimony helped force reforms in U.S. military procurement systems that would last for generations. And it started with a sobering realization. You can't measure courage in torpedo logs, but you can count casualties. And those numbers don't lie. And yet, from that failure came a transformation. By treating the torpedo as secondary and focusing on what actually worked, guns, maneuverability, and surprised the PT force, eventually evolved into something both survivable and effective. They didn't do it because they were ordered to. They did it because they had to. And in doing so, they saved what could have been an entirely lost chapter in U.S. naval warfare. Even the enemy took notice. Captured Japanese records and post-war interrogations revealed something unspoken during the conflict. They stopped fearing torpedo boats, but they never stopped respecting the crews. Commanders like Captain Tamichi Hara wrote in his memoirs that the early PT attacks were confusing but rarely dangerous, their torpedoes unreliable, their tactics predictable. But after the shift to gunboat warfare, the tone changed. They learned. They became hunters of our supply craft. They were no longer nuisances. They were a threat. Perhaps one of the most damning lines came from Admiral Kusaka, who reflected in an Allied interview, "If their torpedoes had worked as intended, I believe many of our garrisons would have collapsed far sooner." That single sentence from the other side captured everything. It wasn't that the strategy was bad. It's that the technology made the strategy impossible. Back home, the public never got the full story. Hollywood told tales of grit and glory aboard torpedo boats. John F. Kennedy, now forever linked to PT 109, became president, lionized for his wartime actions. And to be clear, his bravery was real. But so was the fact that his boat was destroyed. His men killed and nearly all lost without ever firing a single working weapon. The Navy's Public Relations Office packaged survival as victory and turned a tactical failure into political mythology. Because sometimes the symbol matters more than the story. But to the men who lived it, the truth always mattered more. In the years that followed, the phrase PT boat torpedo became quiet slang in post-war military circles. Not as praise, but as a warning. It seeped into whispered evaluations of unstable weapons, overly hyped tech, or systems being deployed before they were fully tested. Don't make it another PT torpedo. It meant don't send anyone to die on blind faith. By the 1,960 seconds, most PT boats were decommissioned. The age of the missile was dawning. Their speed was no longer unique. Their cannons would eventually be outpaced by newer systems. But the lesson they left behind? That endured. PT boats became a study in failure without collapse, a case where equipment failed, but adaptation saved the mission. Their evolution from torpedo ships with no teeth to fast attack gunboats became a rare military example of strategy folding to reality and surviving. They didn't succeed because of how they were built. They succeeded because of how they adapted. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the PT boats. Not the kills, not the medals, not the myth of a torpedo that never hit, but the idea that even in failure, you can salvage function. That courage holds, especially when reality breaks the plan. And the next time a young sailor boards a patrol vessel, manning weapons that have been tested, calibrated, and proven, they have those early crews to thank. They weren't just the cavalry of the seas. They were the caution. They were the warning. And they were the reason the system finally learned what it means to be ready for war.